John, thank you again. We're greatly appreciative for you to give us your time, and you opened us up good on Monday, so we're ready for you to close us out here on Friday, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Well, it's a lot of fun to be with you, and I know this is just one more piece in a day for everybody, but thank you for slicing this time out. And usually when I'm wrestling with the scriptures with people, I like to interact and let them discover the truth. But today I'll just dump the truck. And I got about 20 applications out of this book, but let me give you a few of them. And I know you'll have a few more. You'll have wrestled with this book before. But one of the first things that struck my attention is that Peter wrote this book, and the question is why? I mean, what motivated Peter to write it in the first place? And I think, as I mentioned before, the person that wrote the book with him, Silas, had been to those places. It looks like Peter also, but he must have, and we think that he was probably in Rome at the time of writing. But in any case, he's a long way away from these people. But he has this idea, I need to write to them, and I need to share some thoughts. And I thought, my first application is, who should I relate to in today's craziness, in a sense, the context in which we're in today? Who is hurting out there somewhere? So my suggestion is, after we're done, pray through the rest of the day and try to think through, who is it that I can reach out to? Now, it may be an immediate relative, maybe a friend, maybe somebody from the work colleague, somebody. Who could I reach out to? Because you and I can count on it that in these days of pressure, financial pressure, racial issues, political issues, cultural stuff coming up, pandemic, all of this is quite a mix. And you can count on it, there's somebody somewhere is hurting. And I've had people text me, email me that I haven't heard from for years. I thought, they just say, hey, John, how are you doing? I thought, that's interesting. There's people thinking about others. Maybe they got time. But I would suggest for us guys, since we've got such a heart for influencing others, pray about somebody that you can connect with. And the reason for that is, in the midst of all the pressures and stuff that's going on these days, people need the eternal perspective, because it's very easy in the midst of what we're living in to be overwhelmed by issues and people fighting for this or fighting for that, or campaigning for this, or people complaining about this, or I've lost my job, what do I do next? And I was with our son this morning, and he's last day for his job, but he's been able to line up another job that starts on Thursday. So he's one of the lucky ones, but not everybody can pull that off. And so one of the things I would say is, there's somebody out there that needs an eternal perspective, just to kind of recover from the immediate stuff that they're going through. Now, 1 Peter 1:5-7, he says, we've been given a brand new life. Now, I'm going to be quoting a little bit just from the Message. I thoroughly enjoy the Message. I mentioned I'm in N.T. Wright's version as well at the moment, and I use the NIV and the ESV. But in the Message, he says, we've been given a brand new life and have everything to live for, including a future in heaven, and the future starts now. Now, for some people, it seems like things are sort of sliding. I had a lady in Australia text me, and she says, I'm having suicidal thoughts. I'm seeing a therapist. I'm frustrated. I'm having dreams in the nighttime that are very scary. Can you pray for me? So I gave her a few scriptures to say, you're in the thick of it, and don't give up. Don't lose it, because you have an eternal future. It's okay. Just hang in there. And then it goes on to say, because there's a day that's coming when God will sort it all out, and your life will be complete and healed and whole again. So in other words, people that are really hurting at this time in their lives, they need somebody to just come along and say something. Now, I mentioned the other day, there are more people dying of suicide than there is of coronavirus. Well, that's pretty heavy news. And so there's people that are on the edge, they're slipping. Some people may be seeing a therapist, some are not. But anybody you can think of lives in another state, lives overseas, lives somewhere, just be alert, because people need that eternal perspective. Now, another thing that's interesting, Paul says, well, why are you suffering? Sorry, Peter, why are you suffering? And most people want to know the why, not necessarily, what's God up to, is so much as why is this happening? Why did I lose my job? Why did I lose half my investments? Why these questions come up? Interesting that Peter says there that the reason for your suffering, and it's in the next verses after that, in verses 5 through 7, he says the reason you and I are suffering, he says, so that we will figure out if your faith is real. Because when you go through the fire, two things happen. Either it gets destroyed or it gets purified. And so we're all faith today. How is my faith? How is your faith? Are you really trusting God in the middle of this stuff? Or do you have so many alternate plans to kind of salvage this or do that or do something? Let me encourage you by faith, because it says in the end, on that day, in the message, it says, your faith will be what is displayed as evidence of his victory, not how much gold, not how much resources, not how much all this other stuff. So your faith is far more precious to God than even our physical possessions. We need possessions, but what about our faith? So let me encourage you that one of the reasons we go through tough times is because God is looking for our response. Now, some people say, oh, I wish the circumstances were different. I wish I didn't have these circumstances. The question is, how do I respond to the circumstances? Because my response to the circumstances determines the level of faith that I'm exercising. And so I say to people, well, everything looks tough until you see somebody else's situation. And I'm wrestling with the guys in India, praying with them, because now the coronavirus has sort of taken off in certain parts of India, and they are in trouble. And the guys are trying to feed people. The guys we're working with are business guys and the professional guys, but they're just spending all the money they've got to feed people, to stop people from dying. And I think, man, I'm nowhere near that sort of chaos. But am I exercising faith where I am? Now, it's chapter 1, verse 17. Our life is also a journey. And God has got things in mind that he's doing today. And God isn't erratic in the way he does things. In other words, he's building in your life and my life. And the things that I'm figuring out today are important for what will happen tomorrow and so forth. He says in verse 17 in the message, you must travel, your life is a journey, you must travel with a deep consciousness of God. Your life is a journey, you must travel with a deep consciousness of God. That keeps our sanity. And we just say, Lord, whatever you're up to, help me. Now, one of my favorite verses that I might have mentioned before that I've been praying in these days is Psalm 46:10. Now it says, be still and know that I am God. Just, John, stop. Be still and know that I am God. Now in the message, he says, step out of the traffic. And I thought, yep, the TV, the internet, every source coming in our ears and eyes, it can get overwhelming. And people have told me that they're suffering from sort of a cabin fever, but they're also suffering from too much input and stuff. He says in Psalm 46:10, step out of the traffic, take a long, loving look at me, your high God. So take a long, loving look at me, your high God. Let me suggest, with the time, you've got a little more time than maybe as usual, just take a long, loving look at God. Enjoy God. Be in his presence. Then the verse goes on, above the politics, above everything. And I thought, okay, we can get overwhelmed with the politics today, no matter what party you're in or whatever. And it's true in every country. It's just the politics can be overwhelming. Above the politics. And God said to me, John, I'm in control. Don't sweat the politics. The guys are complaining in India about the politics. Everywhere, everybody's upset, because when a crisis takes place, that's when you find out how people respond. And sometimes it's not always the best. So, and then it says there in the next verses after that, just take time, and I'll jump to chapter 2, verse 2. Long for the spiritual milk of the word. And this is in line with just listening to God. Take a long, loving look at God. Chapter 2, verse 2, he says, long for the spiritual milk. And from the NT Wright translation, it says, the real stuff, not watered down water, not watered down milk. Now in India, when we lived there, the guy would arrive with a cow and they'd be milking it out the front of our place. And he's milking into a bucket. But if you weren't watching, he was also pouring water into the bucket at the same time. So he could make twice as much money. So, of course, everybody finishes up standing out and watching the guy milk the cow, because you want, the milk's already thin enough. I mean, these cows are not like the cows in Nebraska or in the US here. They're pretty thin guys. So we would watch that milk come out and make sure we got as much that was. But let me say to you, long for that spiritual milk. And the grandparents among us all know what it's like. We were with our son this morning and helping out with some stuff. And then their son, who's 15 years of age, 15 months of age, he's having breakfast. And it's not a question of politely waiting for his breakfast. He wants his breakfast. There's no questions. And I remember months ago when he was breastfeeding, you know, when they don't get enough milk, they're on mum's case. They want that milk. And I thought, boy, Lord, long for the spiritual milk of the word, and just enjoy being in God's presence and thoroughly enjoy it. Now, one of the things I've discovered is if you really want to know God and you really search the scriptures, he will answer you. And I tell people, don't sweat all the commentaries, don't sweat all the Bible references, don't sweat all the thousands of books that are written. They're good. But let your first choice always be, God, you teach me. And so the interesting thing is when you go overseas, when you live in other countries, they don't have these resources. And the guys in the village areas, they're lucky to even have a Bible. And so that's all they've got. And these people were getting a letter from Peter, which was their scripture. That was it. So let me encourage you, let us leave aside all the stuff and just listen to God. Now, that came through so strongly to me when I studied the book of Job. Now, Job I'd read every year, but I never quite, I knew the first chapter or two and the last chapter or two, and kind of these guys were all having these discussions all the way through, and I never quite understood what they're all arguing about, except they didn't seem to make a lot of sense. But I said to the Lord, I would really like to understand Job, just like we understand, say, First Peter. And so in the process, I read Job right through in a couple of days. I took the message. Now, I still didn't get a whole lot, so I read it again, and I read it again, and I read it again, and I did this for numerous times, until I was starting to get it. And I can tell you, I'm a bit slow when it comes to the spiritual stuff. And most of us struggle because the spiritual is spiritually discerned. And so as a consequence, after many, many times, I started to follow what were these discussions and what was going on. And then I'd always assumed that the book of Job was about suffering. Well, it is. But it's one of 5 methods that God uses to get our attention. And this is all listed with Elihu, the 4th friend, and they begin to discuss. Now, it has Arabic roots, interestingly enough. The whole book is set in the Arabic context. And in the process of reading it, at the end of the book, I finally figured out what was going on. Genesis 1, 2, and 3, by the way, the creation, evolution stuff, we start with the creation. But one of the most beautiful passages on the creation is Job 38. And God says to Job, okay, you've been asking me to sit down, we have a discussion. Okay, I'm here. And it wasn't in the earthquake or the fire or everything, it was in a still small voice. And his first question, Job, were you there when I did all this? So I asked my creation friends, my evolution friends, were you guys there when God did all this? No, we just have to take by faith what God did. But he said, you're asking the wrong questions. Because he said, if you look at the world, the second question was, do you know the diameter of the earth? Those guys probably didn't even know it was round at that point, let alone how wide the earth was. He says, well, if you knew and understood the size of the earth, you'd understand why you're still alive today. Because if the earth was any closer to the sun, you'd cook up. If it's further away, you'd freeze up. There's a purpose. And I want to tell you why I created. You're worrying about how it happened. Was it 4,000 years? Was it 13.5 billion years? On and on you guys go. But I want to tell you why I did it. And so God created the earth. He says, in order that you may have a home. This is your home. And this is all in Isaiah. He says, but also the second thing is, and this home is designed for you. And so he says, now let me ask you, and he asks Job 70 questions. Well, by that time, Job was sort of gasped. I think I miscued on this one. And it's interesting, the conclusion, because none of those guys prayed, not a single prayer out of these religious sort of experts. I mean, Job prayed, frustrating prayers, but he was talking with God. And God says at the end, hey, Job, you got 3 buddies. They didn't do too well. They didn't even talk to me about all this. They were going off the top of their heads on all this stuff. You better pray for them because I might just, I'm finished with their stuff. Interesting that, and I'll give you the crunch line. I think I've got that here. Job 42 verses 5 and 6. He says, I've heard with my ears all about this, but now I'm seeing with my eyes. Because God says, how many months is a mountain goat pregnant? Well, he didn't have a clue. 12 characteristics of the horse. And he's just asking simple questions about the creation. So he says, Job, if you don't understand these things, how can you understand the big stuff? And so it's interesting that Job had heard a lot with his ears, but now he says, I see with my eyes. God has opened up the creation, the physical revelation, just like we have the spiritual revelation today. And he says, I've explained all this to you. And I think in Job 42, 5 and 6, he says, well, I now have it firsthand. God has talked to me directly, and I'm getting it. And he says, I've heard a lot of stuff, rumors, and he says, I'll no longer live on the crusts and crumbs of others. Now, it's not saying that the commentaries and all are crumbs and crusts, but it's somebody else's food. It's somebody else absorbed their insights from God. So I tell people, what was the book of Job all about? God wanted Job to move to another level in his relationship with him. He wanted him to really know him firsthand, not secondhand, not through others' resources. I want you, Job, you and I, to go deeper. And he uses, I mentioned 5 things, and one of them is suffering. As another one, he's talking through us in the nighttime. And sometimes he talks through the creation and so on. But let me say to you that when we're in tough times, God's talking to us. Right now, God is talking to us in the tough times. Why? Because he wants us to know him more deeply, more intimately. And that's what God's up to. Well, Peter was saying, guys, you're having a tough time. I know that. And God is allowing that to happen so you can experience him more deeply. And all through the book, I mean, you can see there's every few verses, there's something about suffering. And so now the next big area that comes up in chapter 2, verses 4 to 10, he uses all these spiritual terms. He talks about living stones, and he is the living stone. We are living stones. We're constructed into a spiritual sanctuary or a spiritual house. We're holy priests. We do spiritual worship. Now, it's interesting. Romans 9:4 says one of the privileges of the Jewish nation was patriarchs' promises, temple worship. For them, the physical temple was very important. Romans 12, 1 and 2, he says, but now you offer your lives as a sacrifice to God. This is your spiritual worship. So what's the difference? Physical worship depends on a place, music and so forth, all the physical things. Nothing wrong with that. But he says we live now with spiritual worship. It's worship that is your lifestyle. It's the way you live. It's 24/7. People say, do you worship God? I say 24/7. Now, if I want to have a special worship service on a Sunday, that's great. Nothing wrong with that. But for the person that's all they think of when they think of worship, they've missed out on the whole thing, because worship is your lifestyle. This is your spiritual worship. So what was Peter up to? Well, these guys, obviously, most of them wouldn't have had any synagogue. They didn't have the temple in Jerusalem. They didn't have the physicals. And that's one of the things that's happening to us right now. We don't have the physicals. But what do we have? We have relationships. And that's the kingdom. Because the kingdom of heaven, as you run through the parables in the 4 Gospels, is all about relationships. Relationship with God, relationship with my spouse, relationship with family, relatives, the world. That's the kingdom. That can function anywhere. That can function inside Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, inside Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, whatever. The kingdom is the real deal, because it's the relational side. We're not dependent. Now, if we have physical structures, that's great. And but I was thinking, we couldn't go to Mo Ranch, but Mo Ranch can come to us. We may not get to a physical church, but the church comes to us because we are the church. Now, if we go to church, that's great, but we are the church. And so right now, today, we're relating to one another. And so this is what Peter was encouraging them to think. Think spiritual, think kingdom, think relational. And so the guys in India said to me, John, we're talking about family is church. I thought that's interesting, because everybody's locked down in India. It's been really tough. No planes, no trains, no buses, no carts, bikes, bicycles, zero, no movement at all. Well, of course, that's total lockdown. The guys have said to me, hey, we've discovered family is church. And I thought, what do you mean? They said, well, right in our own family, we pray together, we share the scriptures together, we talk to the neighbor next door, we talk to the neighbor across the street, we're on the phone to somebody and so on. And we've discovered family is church. I thought they had just hit a key core, because we think of the word church, ecclesia, means a group of people that get together. And it was actually a legal term. But the word oikos, which means household, it occurs more times than ecclesia. In fact, it occurs over 900 times in the Old Testament. The household was the key. The household is the center of society. What is it? Genesis 12:3, through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. The family is right at the heart of the gospel. And so family is church. Isn't that an exciting thought? Now, connecting with others is important, connecting with friends, but your family, and usually it's 3 generations. We got parents. In our case, our parents have passed on, but in many families, there's older people. There's also younger people. There's 3 generations in many cases. But that is church. And the exciting thing is church is relationships. Now, that puts a lot of pressure on doing things right relationally. It's not so much how good are this program or that program, how good are the relationships? And that's where Paul and Peter is coming through strongly. He says, 1 Peter 2:22, after your lives get cleaned up, love one another. That phrase comes up several times. So loving people is very key, which means I think about people, which means that I'm praying and thinking, how can I do something for that person? Well, he goes on to say, chapter 2, verse 11, and he says, it's the evil desires that wage war against your soul. Now, we have wars today in our society of all kinds, but let me tell you that the biggest battle that all of us face is going on in the mind. The evil desires that wage war against your soul. So let me say, guard what's going on in here. because that's where the battle really is, because that'll determine how you behave to others. And so he says, the evil desires that wage war against your soul. It's the inner war that's the tough one. And then he says, as a result of that, I will love those who are around me and live good lives amongst the lost. Let me encourage you to keep living your life amongst the lost. Who do you play tennis with? Who do you eat with? Who do you hang out with? We work at getting all of our social needs with the lost. And that's great, because if the only people you're relating to are believers, then hopefully they see your good life and they're encouraged, and vice versa. But the lost need to see a good life lived, and they need to see how you're responding to the pandemic or the racial issues or whatever. How are you responding to all this stuff? The lost need to see that and need to be observing that. And so that's very important. Well, he goes on to talk about respecting authority, respecting governments. They're all important. Being a good employee, and that's important. And let me say that in this context, he says, watch your tongue. I find that people a little more, what would you say, a bit short, can be a little bit antsy because things aren't going too well in their own life. So do we give grace there? And we may not be suffering in the way that some people are, but Jesus has gone through everything that you and I have gone through. That's interesting. In 1 Peter, he says, they've called him every name in the book. This was Jesus. And he said nothing back. He suffered in silence. Boy, isn't that a tough one? He suffered in silence, content what God would set things right. Let me say, when things go out of focus, just look at Jesus' life. What did he suffer? What did he go through? I mean, they were trying to kill him from the day he started his public ministry. And what are we losing as life goes on? Now, I would say, for me, for example, one of the things that gets me excited is helping other people. But I've had to cancel every trip for this year because I know that it's just not possible. And the guys in India said, when are you coming? Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, India. Hey, when are you coming, John? Well, guys, I can't do it. But we can talk. We can still talk. We can text. We can chit-chat. In other words, the physicals don't necessarily have to determine everything. But there'll be certain things in your life and my life that we just don't have at this point. But that's okay. Now, in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, he gives a couple of helpful thoughts for husbands and wives, and that was a great session yesterday. Really enjoyed that. He says, well, for ladies, cultivate inner beauty. If you've got outer beauty, maximize it. But the inner beauty is the most important because that's what really attracts people. Cultivate that inner beauty. But for men, honor your wives, delight in them, treat them as equals. That last phrase is probably the toughest for all of us men. Treat them as equals. We don't always do that very well. But let me tell you that 1 Peter 3:1 gives us a clue, because he says the wife can win a husband without a word because her life is different. Let me say that any relationship you have that's a 24/7 relationship, husband, wife, brothers and sisters or cousins or anybody living under your roof, that there's a 24/7 relationship, you can win them without a word. And so I encourage that with all families. Just love them, live differently, and let God take his time in their lives. You say, well, when do I ever say something? If all I have to do is live well. Well, let me tell you, they will ask. And the reason they will ask is 1 Peter 3:15, when they've got a question. And so I do that with my Muslim friends and Hindu friends. Just love them, be friends with them, walk with them. No rush, no panic. I'm not in a time frame. I'm just relaxed. And as they watch me 24/7, they're observing a lot of things. There comes a time when they ask, what is the reason of the hope that's within you? Hey, man, what makes you tick? There's something different about you. Now, you may not ask it so straight out forward, but he starts to ask side questions. Well, John, how do you invest your money? How do you make relationships work? How don't you get so shot off with people? What is it that helps you in your relationships? On and on, sort of question. But they're really hedging for the real question, what makes you tick? And that's when I open up the scriptures and all. And so all the friendships I have, relationships, I just pray like crazy. And then I just say, Lord, when they're thirsty, I'm ready. And now there's sometimes opportunities just naturally come. So take whatever opportunities come. But many times we get under pressure to kind of witness. And I tell people, the non-Christian can smell it when you're coming at them, trying to witness to them. They can smell it coming. Here comes that stuff. My sister was like that with me. She said, you always make me a project. Every time you show up, you try to push the conversation into spiritual stuff. I said, and I apologized. I said, I'm sorry. What I realized was I was treating her like a project instead of like my sister. And so I tried to figure out, now, what is my sister like? She likes Japanese art. So I went to a lot of trouble to get some Japanese art and gave it for her next birthday, and she was blown away. My brother actually recognizes that I'm his sister. So that started a journey. And I learned very quickly that don't sort of manipulate or whatever, just relax. And then it tells us in 1 Peter 4:1, this is a very powerful verse. And it's a verse, I'll read it to you in the message. He says, since Jesus went through everything you're going through and more. Now that's good news, isn't it? Many times I think, oh, Jesus never suffered much. He never went through all that I go through. Since Jesus went through everything you're going through and more, learn to think like him. So there comes a time they start to think like Jesus. Think of your sufferings as a weaning from that old sinful habit of always expecting to get your own way. Whoops, that's pretty powerful. Then you'll be able to live out your days free to pursue what God wants instead of being tyrannized by what you want. That's another powerful thought as to why we suffer. Because whatever we're going through, God is actually wanting you to learn to think like him and not be so tyrannized by what I want, but what does he want? And so many times, as we get older, people worry about retirement funds and all that sort of thing. And that's interesting to watch how people panic about that. Well, yeah, it's okay if other people are panicking, but when we panic, that becomes a different story. But whatever we're going through, God is helping us to think like him. And so that's a powerful verse. And so verses 7 to 11, he says, pray, love, give a meal to somebody, be generous. And then he says in verse 12, back to the case of people going through tough times. He says, friends, when life gets really tough, this is again in the Message, chapter 4, verse 12, don't jump to the conclusion God is not on the job. Most of us, when things go wrong, God, where are you? You didn't notice that I was in trouble. God, where are you? And instead, be glad that you're in the very thick of what God and Christ experience. This is our spiritual refining process with glory just around the corner. There is a spiritual refining process that's going on through these tough, difficult times. And all of these thoughts become a tremendous encouragement to others as they're going through the tough times. I had a good friend, a Japanese family, and Tadashi passed away 2 weeks ago. He was in his late 50s. Well, I talked to the three sons. In fact, I've helped all three sons in their spiritual journeys, and to his wife, Tamako, the widow, and she's really having a tough time. So I shared these thoughts that are just here in 1 Peter. And she said, oh, that's so encouraging, so helpful. She said, I didn't know if God was on the job. I felt, why did my husband die so rapidly? He died of pancreatic cancer and it just got him within weeks. Well, it just kind of, boom, it kind of, she wasn't ready for it, or the three sons either. But and two of them are married. And as we've been dialoguing and talking, one of the things I found so helpful last night, just talking through some of these things in this book, that God he's on the job. We may not see it. And God has already experienced everything you're experienced. So I said, Tamika, you're experiencing the losing your husband. That's huge. But it's okay. He understands. I can't identify with you on it, but I said Jesus can. And shared 1 Peter 5:7, where he says, cast all your anxieties on him. The word anxiety means conflicting emotions. You're thinking this way, but it's happening this way. And he says, put all these anxieties on him because he cares for you very much. And that's what she did. Well, that's, and then again in verse 19, chapter 4, verse 19, he says, well, then when you find life difficult, take it in stride, trust him. He knows what he's doing and he'll keep on doing it. People have all the predictions on the coronavirus and, when is it going to stop? And we're sort of starting to see a bit of a peak and all that. Who knows? But I don't think this is going to go away very quickly. And we may be in for months and possibly even a couple of years. Now, I'm not a prophet and I'm not a medical person, but what I am saying is the problems just don't disappear. And sometimes people think, well, once I've got my debts sorted out, once I've sorted out my relationship with my spouse, we're dealing with one of our relatives, she divorced, and it's chaos, and her two daughters are kind of chaotic, and she said, when am I ever going to get sorted out? So we said, well, it's going to take some time. It's a journey. And so my wife's texting with Lynn and trying to help us sort through stuff. And there's a lot of emotion and anger and all that. But things don't just stop. Just when you think you're on top, boom, something else happens. And so it's, in a sense, learning to respond to the circumstances, not run away from the circumstances, which is what Lynn's trying to do. Well, in chapter 5, he gives some advice to leaders, and for all of us on this call, all of us are influencing other people and got a concern for others. Let me encourage you, he says, care for the flock of God. We're not responsible for the flock of God, but we care for them. And the message says, not bossily telling others what to do, but tenderly showing them the way. And just as God is so tender with us and so loving with us, so we are tender and loving with others. Now, I find with my own experiences, I relate to the many lost friends. Some of them have ripped me off financially. I've had 2 times I've been ripped off financially. I've had other times that I felt like I got sort of put in a vice. He used me to get a admission to another country or whatever. All kinds of things go on with us. But let me tell you that God takes care of that kind of stuff. But my role is to be humble, it says, not be the boss, to be caring. And I'm not, it's very helpful to know that we're not responsible for other people, that we're all God's children. But we can care for others. We have a shepherding heart. We're concerned for people. And so that's why verse Peter 5:7, cast all your anxieties. And it says all, just put them all on there. Sometimes we carry the monkeys around on our back for some time. But man, get them off the back today. Just put them all on. Write them down. Put them in your diary. And then he says, but we are in a battle. And just when we think we are strong enough to fight the issues of the day, just remember this, stay alert. Now, this is 5:17. He says, we have an enemy. And sorry, not verse 8, verse 9. We have an enemy. And the enemy is described as a roaring lion. Now, if you're familiar with lions, I mean, most of us aren't running around with lions, but I've seen enough lions in India. And we have a couple of mountain lions out near the hospital where I take Ruth, but I haven't met up with them, but hear about them. But a lion that roars is an old lion. The young lions don't have to roar. They're fast and they can catch their prey. But when the lion gets old, he has to roar in order to scare the prey. And that's how Satan is described. He's dangerous, but he can't get you unless you let him. So he's a roaring lion. He has to frighten you. He has to freak you out. And I say to people, just be alert to the enemy, but don't panic. He can't get you. And he'll try to frighten the daylights out of you, or he'll try to tempt you very subtly with all kinds of sexual desires and all. He'll try every trick in the book. And let me say that Satan is smarter than us. So don't try to think you can beat Satan. You can't. He can outbeat you very easily. But what I need to do is just say, Lord, help me. Stand strong in the faith. Be alert. And prayer is very helpful for me, just to be praying, just to have scriptures on my mind. When I have sensual thoughts, lustful thoughts, I run through certain verses. Job, the man of God, says, I have made a covenant with my eyes that I might not look and lust after a woman. And so the battle for us men especially is with our eyes. And so when you find yourself going to that, there's certain verses that I'll quote and just resist the devil. And he will flee from you. And that's good news. Resist him, stand strong in your faith. He's gone. But don't give him an inch. He'll take a mile if you do. What's interesting, and I'll just close with this thought, that there's two people mentioned at the end of the book. One is Silas, who helped him write the book, and had been in that area, what's modern Greece today, and he had been a tremendous help to Peter. Then there's a guy named Mark, and he says Mark sends his word too. Now, Mark had been a bit of a failure when he was on Paul's team, but Peter says, Mark's a good guy, and he sends his word and greetings to you as well. And Peter was kind of a spiritual father to Mark. So we all have our journeys. Mark had his downsides, but it appears from Peter's experience at this point, he's doing well. Silas proved to be just a real gem to help him all the way. Well, there's a bundle of thoughts I've just thrown out, but I would say the conclusion for me is pray about somebody that you can get involved with today that is just on the fringes, relative, friend, somebody from the workplace, somebody that you've seen some time back, and just because they may need this kind of input. I was amazed watching as I was sharing the scriptures last night with Tamako, that her heart was really encouraged. And so she was meeting her son that night, meeting another son at lunch today, and I could see her spirits were lifted as she was hearing the good news that Peter was giving his friends in that day. So just look for that opportunity today. Pray about somebody that you can significantly encourage. Now, it could be a believer. It could be an unbeliever, to know that life could start today, and just reach out to somebody that may be looking for encouragement today. Well, let me stop there. It's a fabulous book, great book for pandemic days, and come back and review any of these lessons and recognize that you and I are in a journey, and that's what's happening to us today, whatever it is, that God is allowing it in order to change us and to make us more like him. Back to you, Sam.
All right. Thank you so much, John. We had talked about you would show us how this book applies to our life, and I took pages of notes today, and I look forward to going back through this recording because there was so much in it, so much application to our lives. I meet with a guy that is not quite yet in Christ, and he doesn't see the relevancy of Scripture. And so it's just very powerful how relevant you made it today and how much it does apply to our lives. So thank you again. I'm going to unmute everybody. And so if you have a loud background and you're not going to ask a question, please mute yourself. But I'm going to unmute everyone so you can ask questions. Okay, everyone is unmuted. Any questions, anybody?
Jay, you got to unmute yourself.
For some reason, Jay it's muted when it's on my Zoom call. It's the strangest thing. So he might have been saying goodbye. Who knows? John, I did have a question for kind of clarification on how you handle a situation where, when you're talking about you only share when asked, and you talked about people may start to ask you how you handle things like, how do you handle money? How do you handle when someone puts you off and things like that? And then you said, but when someone asks you what makes you tick, that's when you really open up the spiritual side of things. So I was curious, when they ask you about, say, how do you handle your money, do you not share that you have a biblical perspective on money, or do you wait and save that for a bigger day?
Yeah, good question, Sam. And I think my feeling is your spiritual values run through any answer that you give. So if they say, about handling finances, what I'll do is say, well, there's 5 principles I've found helpful. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to do that. A guy says, yeah, tell me. Now, those principles, the first one is, well, I always, make sure that God has all of my finances 100%. So I pray about every dollar, everything, all the income. And I pray about what do you want me to do with that? And I said, and then I rattle on in a sense as if the Bible's just a natural thing, because it's just part of my life. Now he'll listen to me, kind of intrigued, and I'll tell him, well, he says, I said, I'd like to make sure my finances are such that God has first say on everything. And so I pray through it all. And I can lose it all tomorrow. I mean, things can go haywire. So he's listening to me as I talk about I need daily, give us, Lord, our daily needs. I have certain needs every day. I have a little budget that I work on. I save some money for these reasons and so on. So he starts to see, and then oftentimes I'll put a little hook in, but I said, the key is, how can I do this well? And I said, for me, it's having a personal relationship with God. I've got to have God's say on things. So if you're interested in that, I'd love to start a journey of figuring out who Jesus is and how he reveals God to us. So it's not so much an either or as I kind of play it with the kind of questions they ask. And probably what I'm saying is that sometimes people ask questions that are not quite, you could say, spiritual questions, but they're questions that they're trying to figure out life. And so how do you, common questions, how do you discipline your children? Well, actually, I didn't share this today, but it's interesting. In 1 Peter, he gives a beautiful session on how God the Father handles us. And he says, talk to God and God will give you whatever you ask. That explains that God is a good father. And I'd be telling him this. But I said, he doesn't allow us with sloppy living. So he's a responsible father. Now, those are the 2 qualities of a father, that I'm good and I'm responsive and I help our children. But at the same time, I'm also concerned that they don't live in a sloppy way. And so I hold them to accountability. I'm responsible for them. So I say, when you think of that's how God handles me, how should I handle my children? So I give him those 2 principles out of 1 Peter 1. And he says, oh, okay, that's sort of helpful. Now that sometimes leads to the more in-depth discussion of how can he have a relationship with God. I said, that's how God wants us to raise our children. Well, do I need to discipline my children? I said, sure, that's part of your responsibility. But you have to love. And Proverbs 13:4, he says that it's a 2-fisted fight. He who loves his son is diligent to discipline him. So there's a consistency in the discipline as well as the love. So I say that's kind of my clues. Now I'm actually just sharing scripture, which is he figures that's what's going to come anyway. But I don't push it beyond where I think he is. So I said, if that, provokes you to think about your relationship with God, I'd be very happy to chat more. So I kind of don't force things or don't grab the opportunity in an unnatural way, but I sort of let him sort of set the pace. And if he says, yeah, boy, that's fascinating. So I'm constantly, every question that comes, it'll be saturated with biblical thinking in a very natural way. I'm not preaching at him, but I'll just give him some thoughts. Then that see how that sits, and if he likes what I'm saying, I said, well, if you're ever interested, I'd be very happy to start a journey, just figuring out who is Jesus. And now I use John's Gospel to do that. You can use any of the Gospels, because a guy will say to me, what do you mean, start a journey to figure out who is Jesus? I said, so I'll pull out my Gospel. I think I've got one on the table somewhere. and I'll have my Gospel and we'll read right there, and I'll read page 1, he reads page 2. And I said, what do you think? Well, he may not think anything. Or sometimes you say, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Or why did Jesus say that? So I said, why do you think he said that? So I refuse to answer questions, because the moment you do that, the conversation stops. So I'll keep the questions running. And he says, well, I guess maybe this, or then he'll ask me, but John, you know this book better than I do. What do you think? I said, no, this book's designed for anybody, anywhere in the world. And so you can be the expert, because it's your life that's touching and so on. So I'm always avoiding trying to give answers, but trying to ask the right questions. So that so it's constant process of sort of exposure to my life, asking just the normal questions of life out of his thinking without him feeling cross-examined. I mean, some people kind of, get uncomfortable because they ask so many questions. Hey man, just relax and enjoy life. So I'm constantly, now our neighbor around the street, Chase, he's a wild man, and he drives these cranes, these, the high level buildings. Well, he's a laugh a minute. We have a lot of fun, but I know underneath him, he's kind of a searching heart. He's not going to sort of say that to me, but we relax together, we enjoy together, and the conversations get a little longer. And that's one of the things I didn't mention when I was talking, is because of the coronavirus, most people are doing more walking around the neighborhood. And I would really encourage you, keep doing that. I mean, I didn't do that before, I was too busy. But now I walk the dogs around the neighborhood, and I've met probably 5 or 6 new people because they're hanging around, and sort of chit-chatting. So let that be just an ongoing pattern. I've decided, man, I'm going to keep doing this. This is good. But I'd never discovered that if we hadn't been forced to sort of be at home. Yeah. And, so, yeah, I think, Sam, I'm just learning all the time how to do this. But I find that I've really tuned into when they get interested. Because, we've all had people try to evangelize us. I've been on a plane and, where can you go? And the guy next to you starts this barrage. And I thought, oh, come on, man. So but learning to respond when they ask the questions. I think Aaron had his hand up, did he? I think, Aaron, you have to unmute, I think.
There we go.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Sam knows to not let me just have free reign of being able to talk, John. So, Jay's muted, but I called him to get his question. He was asking, I do have a follow-up, but Jay has a new neighbor that happens to be a Sikh.
Oh, yes.
And he was wondering if you knew about Sikhs and maybe could provide some insight on how he might relate to this man.
Yes, that's a great question. And Jay, what I would do is ask him, because strangely enough, in all religions, everybody has their own opinion in that religion. So you can ask 1,000 Muslims and get 1,000 different answers, 1,000 Hindus, 1,000 Sikhs, 1,000 Christians, and you'll get 1,000 different answers. So, but the fastest way to learn is to say to him sometime, oh boy, I'd love to understand more about Sikhism. Now, actually, it's a very open religion. As you know, it's a mix of Hinduism and Islam together, but it's very clean. They're places of worship. There's no idols. It's not like the Hindu scene. In that sense, it's more like Islam. But most Sikhs, their scriptures talk about one that will come one day. But I wouldn't air my knowledge, because usually our knowledge is not always very good anyway. But let him tell you, oh, do you have some scriptures that you read? He'll say, yes. You could say, boy, I'd be fascinated to know what your scriptures tell us about how to live life. And let him educate you. Now, that's a lot of fun because it's kind of, you know, you're learning firsthand. And in the process, I wouldn't try to, don't get into that position of religion versus religion, you know, Sikhism versus Christianity. Rather, learn from him about Sikhism, because in the process, you're on his turf and he's comfortable. And he tells you, and I just keep going on that journey, because as time goes on, he will give you a sense of who he thinks God is. And then you can walk with him on that. And so you walk together rather than confront. And in the process of walking together, there's many Sikhs I know have come to faith. They're a very, very responsive group, but they don't respond to the typical Western approach of, you know, preaching the gospel at them. That doesn't do much. But being friends and hanging out, and usually they love sports and they love food, and they're great people to get to know. So, Jay, that's really neat, just kind of chit-chatting and talking and letting things happen naturally, and let him be your teacher and your guide on Sikhism. And then you'll see the common areas as time goes on. I never pick on the things that you know, kind of crunch, but I always pick on the common ground. And that way we keep going. And he'll just respect your life. He'll respect your family. You know, when they see families, they have a lot of high regard for that. Aaron, did you have a follow-up question?
There we go. Sorry, I guess every time I press mute to drown out my kids, I get muted. But I was wondering what the word that you mentioned, I've read a lot, or I've just heard a lot about ecclesia.
Yes.
But what was the word you mentioned that was household?
Oh, household. And it's the word oikos. Oikos is the Greek word oikos, which translates into English economy. So we have a national economy, we have a state economy, we have a family economy. So your family, and so the word oikos basically is the household. Now, a beautiful example is Cornelius in Acts 10. And it's fascinating the way Acts 10 and 11 opens up, because there's 6 natural networks in any oikos or any family household. And the first is you and I, our immediate family. Then secondly, our relatives. And then thirdly, in Cornelius' case, people that worked for him and people also worked with him. Then his neighborhood knew him. And then he was also concerned for people that were poor. And he helped out the poor Jewish scene. So Cornelius, so all those relationships. So you can see that a typical oikos or household, your household or my household, actually consists of a lot of people. They're all connected to us, all relationally connected. Probably the average person, 20 or 30 people in an oikos, in a household. So that's why it can be church, because it just is probably enough people in that context that make up the gifts that are needed for a church to function well. And so I encourage people, think household, because it's one of about 28 illustrations of the people of God. But the oikos is a good one because they're relationships that are well defined. And so if you just think of a group of people, it gets a bit fuzzy. But as soon as you think of a household, and families, there's a lot of relationships there that you can connect to and think about how my parents and my children and my siblings and their kids and so on. So it quickly becomes quite a few people. So that's the way to think in terms of oikos. That word occurs about 116 times in the New Testament, and it occurs over 900 times in the Old Testament. So it was the way that God thought, through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So God thinks in terms of family. So I encourage people to always relate to families as families. Doesn't matter, kids running everywhere, chaos, that's just life. And enjoy the family context. Now, the family relationships are the toughest. Just when you think you got it together, you know, between you and your spouse and your son and your daughter and so on. These take time and effort. But boy, do the lost long for that. And so many families are dysfunctional, where dad's not talking to the son, or, you know, and when they see a family that's not smooth, but they can tell the relationships are good. That is very good feeling. And that's why when non-Christians are part of our context, they just feel good. In fact, they usually don't want to go home because they're enjoying a context where people are relaxed and happy. So that's very helpful, and it runs all through. So actually, the Matthew 28, 19 and 20, when God gave that commission, that great commission to those 12 Jewish apostles, remember they were used to thinking in a Jewish way, and the Jews, the Shema, or the great, what we think of love God, is Deuteronomy 6, the great kind of, you could say, sermon that God said to the people of Israel before they went into the promised land. Hey, listen up. The Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Then he says, and love your family. When you get up in the morning, when you lie down at night, when you walk along the road. So the essence for the Jew in terms of discipling the nation was disciple your family and your extended family and so forth. So when they got Matthew 28, 19, their thinking was, oh, this is what we did for our nation. Now we do it for the nations. And so their thought would always be to make disciples, not of individuals, but like they did with their families and their friends and so forth. Now, we've interpreted Matthew 28, 19 in a Western context, because we think, in a sense, very individualistic, you know, personal rights and personal this and personal Jesus and personal Savior. We tend to shrink it all down to personal. Nothing wrong with that, but the essence of what God's talking about is the family. And so when the family's functioning, that means the individuals all have to function. It's not like you've got to have everybody playing their part. And so when we make disciples of the nations, we may start with a businessman, we may start with a student, we may start with a housewife, but very soon we're relating to their family and their network. And that's because of me teaching in the universities. Many times I'd meet students and then they'd come to faith, but I would never evangelize in a sense. I'd always relate to their family and connect with their family and then bring the good news into the context. So it's an ongoing process to really connect to the family.
So are you saying all nations kind of in your interpretation means like all families? Did I catch that right? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
So all the Hindus I relate to them maybe initially as one person, but then very quickly it becomes the family, because the family is the solid unit. It's the unit by which the finances are handled, the decisions are made. So if you just pick off one person, and this is even more true in the Muslim or Hindu scene, you really isolate them from their own natural network, their own support system. So we always kind of work with the whole family. And then in village areas, we work with the head of the whole village. So we always respect the structure, the authority structure. And so in that case, we will touch individuals, no doubt. But I tell people, think in terms of families, because that's the way God thinks. And you run through the whole Gospels, you run through the whole book of Acts, it's families 90% of the time. but there'll be occasional individuals, and a person like Lydia that was probably a widow, and you have the Ethiopian eunuch. He was a single man. So it's not saying only families, but that's predominantly the way the Spirit of God spreads through the nations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John, you talked a lot about relationships. So I wanted to share a quick story that happened yesterday. My wife, Carrie, is a teacher at a school that has a lot of hard cases in it, elementary age kids that go through horrible situations. And a lot of the trauma that happens to these kids happens in the womb, where the mother's abused or taking drugs, and they're finding out that there's already a lot of damage done to those kids. And then when they're born, the trauma and damage continues. And so they've had to, as teachers of these kids, they've had to come up with ways to help them. And they've tried everything, every kind of teaching program. You can imagine the full things that they've tried, but they don't really work. So now what they've found that works is just to have a relationship with the kid. So now they're promoting more, just have a relationship with this kid. Don't worry if you need to just sit with them and color with them and talk to them, do that. But it just speaks to the power of relationships and the importance of them.
Yes. And that's the kingdom stuff. I mean, that's, and when all the physical structures collapse, which they tend to be doing right now, the relational stuff comes much sharper, much clearer into focus. Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, final call. Any questions? All right. Well, John, I'll thank you on behalf of everybody. And I've been sending these recordings out, and people are starting to watch them more and more. So those who are at work and couldn't get away are able to see these videos. So thank you again, John. It's been great to have you for these 2 days. And everyone, we'll see you soon, I'm sure. Love you guys.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sam. It's been a lot of fun.
Bye.
Bye.